What's up and welcome back to the channel. If you initially subscribed because you like the Z125 swap KLX 110, I'm sorry I don't have any updates for you right now. It is just I don't have enough content to even make a full video. I've had issues with the fuel pump. I talked about that initially and they're still proving to be a problem. So I promise I will update that as soon as I can. Today's video is about my 91 Mitsubishi Mighty Max. I've had a lot of people ask me in the comments what it is, why I built it. You know, I've never really talked about it. And mostly it was just because I thought it would be kind of boring. It's like 90% complete and I like to start the projects from the very beginning when I do like a video series or whatever. But regardless, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about it, and I do have a lot of stuff I wanna do, so hopefully that's interesting to you guys, and over the next few weeks we can talk about more. Now the title of this video, World's Most Built Mighty Max, or whatever, Craziest Mighty Max, I'm not trying to be cocky there, I really just wanted to get you here and then you can decide for yourself. Now it's not because I'm the most talented, it's just because no one cares about this chassis. So if I do claim any records, it's only because this is not a very popular thing to build. But regardless, check it out, let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. For my first video on this truck, I just want to give you a little intro about it, why I have it, why I built it, what it's for, and obviously the setup that you're currently looking at. So it's a 91 Mitsubishi Mighty Max single cab short bed. Originally had a 4G64 single cam 4-cylinder. It was on leaf springs and completely stock. I bought it had just been painted red, but everything else was completely factory. Might as well just start with the drivetrain first. The engine bay is definitely the most complete part of the truck at this time. We got a 6-bolt 4G63 block, 7-bolt 4G head. Bottom end has Crowler rods, CP pistons. Top end has SuperTech valves, standard size. SuperTech dual springs, TI retainers, and bronze valve guides. GSC S2 billet camshafts. And then all of this is pushing the exhaust out through a 304 stainless Schedule 40 1.25" ID pipe runners to a HX35. This is a whole set 7-blade compressor wheel with the Bullseye Power T3 0.63 AR exhaust housing, and then a 3-inch exhaust, which is obviously super standard. This turbo is not my first choice given this current setup, but when I initially started gathering parts, it was gonna be a stock motor, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. But I'm still really happy with this turbo. It's just obviously not the newest technology. They are cheap though. And then 2.5-inch intercooler pipes going to a Vibrant 650 horsepower intercooler core. Out of the intercooler to the intake manifold, going past this Tile Q 50 mil blow-off valve, billet S90 throttle body, and a Fab rear-wheel drive spec intake manifold with the street plenum and then the smaller ports that work in conjunction with the 7-bolt head. We got a Frontline Fab billet valve cover. Really stoked on that setup. It's dirty right now, but it's pretty amazing looking when it's clean. And then K-series ignition coils on top for ignition control. Fuel system wise, we've got an air motive pump, which I'll show you the fuel cell in a minute, but it's an eliminator pump. Tons of flow, really, really loud. Wish I would have known how loud it was, but they are sick as far as E85 compatible systems go. It should work really well. Still on pump gas right now, but it's pushing it up to a Magnus fuel rail through a Dash 10 feed line, which is absolutely overkill for this setup. Dash 6 return off the rail to a Fuel Lab mini regulator mounted right here. And then we've got our AEM fuel pressure sensor tapped into the rail itself. And we have some Injector Dynamics 1700cc injectors for our fueling. Wiring harness wise, this is a mil-spec designed harness, so we've got like the firewall plug that's quick disconnect. We've got a Rywire plug itself, or the firewall plate. I powder coated it black, and then I built this harness from scratch, so it's all Tefcell wire and Raycam DR25 heat shrink. And on the other side of the firewall is an AEM Infinity 506, which has done really well this far, and it honestly makes it a hell of a lot easier than if you were to wire this up to a stock ECU, whether it's DSM or anything else for that matter. Going standalone is definitely easy. Catch cans, we've got what I tried to be the most symmetrical setup possible. These are just 2 aluminum cans, powder coated black. We've got a Dash 10 feed line off of each valve cover going to the can, and then on the bottom on this side it's tapped into the dipstick here, and on the other side it taps into the bottom of the block. Really didn't want to have crankcase pressure problems, so I just went the extra mile in the very beginning, and so far so good. There are inner fenders that go right here to cover the wheel wells, so it doesn't get as dirty as you can see the firewall is right now. Just haven't put them in for whatever reason. And then down here we've got a small drain on the bottom of each can, and with a lot of steering angle that I fortunately have, you can just crank the wheel, reach in with a water bottle, crack the valve, and let the oil drain into it. Boost control wise, we've got a Tile 44mm wastegate with the external dump tube going out the top of the hood, which you may have seen in one of my other videos. All of the vacuum lines are braided Dash 4 AN line for maximum reliability, at least that's the goal. And then down here on the frame rail you can see there is a Mac 3-port boost control solenoid down there, kind of tucked out of the way. That does all of the boost regulation via the AEM 506. Looking at the accessories, this is a Saturn GM SL2 alternator. It's pretty ugly with that fan on there, but it's rated at like 240 amps. This one's obviously been rewound, so it does a great job given the higher electrical load that I've got with all these accessories that you'll see here in a second. We've got a really ugly water pump pulley that needs to be taken off and painted or powder coated. This is some random Mitsubishi pulley that I got at the junkyard that happens to have the right offset to run this belt configuration. I've got a 4G64 water pump, which gives you better water pump or water line routing to feed the heater core. Yes, it still has heat, thankfully, and it helps you run this water line kind of back over there. So it was chopped here and we welded this outlet on. But yeah, it's got to be cleaned up. And then we've got a fluid amper crank pulley. And one day I will hook the belt up to this AC compressor over here, which will be and should be fully functional. Just haven't got to a point where I want to charge the system yet, so that has been left till later. Radiator wise, we've got a Rye-Wire CSF Quartz 9-inch by 24-inch wide radiator, which amazingly does a fantastic job. This thing's not making that much power right now, but so far so good. We've gone through a complete summer and never seen a water temp over like 198, 199, so we're sitting pretty at this current time. 2 Durale 8-inch fans to get everything cooled down, and then a custom water neck that was made to extend the fill point with a vibrant cap, just so that we can bleed the system, because with the radiator mounted so low, it would be very difficult without a pressure bleeder. This way, it may not look tall enough, but you can pop this off and put a drain funnel or a fill funnel on here, get the overall height to about like this, jack the front of the truck up, and it's honestly super easy to bleed. It couldn't be simpler. Looking at some of the wiring, I really went out of my way to run this wiring through the frame everywhere that I could. So if you look here, you can see there's a small grommet where the wiring comes out. Obviously it goes through this tube front and into the cabin, and then here it just ties into the headlight, HID projector, so on and so forth. For this projector, I actually have remote ballast, so they sit inside under the dash, and then I have a longer harness to plug into that. And then looking back on this side, you'll see I've got some extra wiring here. That single one loaned by itself is actually for a front camera that will go on when the front bumper goes on. And then the fan wiring and everything comes out of that same frame rail as well. Before we move outside, I'll talk about the suspension. 240SX S13 front subframe. I bought an entire front clip and just stole all the parts from it. I've got these little tabs you can see here where these 2 silver bolts are, so the subframe is still completely removable. And then I welded on new engine mounts, which they're a little bit hard to see, but that way you can drop the subframe without supporting the motor, since it will just stay bolted in as usual, or you can pull the motor without pulling the subframe, which probably not really that necessary. It's easy to pull off, but it is an option. And then we have a Wisefab angle kit. This is a V1 kit. The V2 kit came out probably a month after I bought this setup, so I'm stuck with it. Unless I damage it, there's no real need to replace it with the V2, although it does look better. And then S13 function form coilovers, which were only purchased so I could get it together. Those will eventually be changed out for something a lot nicer once I can get the weight of the vehicle and order proper spring rates to work accordingly. This is for a hood strut, which I clearly don't have on because I have my trusty yardstick level here, but eventually that will go on once these are all painted. It's a little bit difficult to constantly put them on and off when I'm removing panels. And then moving outside, you will see there are 6-piston Brembo front brakes on the front end, and then moving to the back, there are 4-piston calipers that work in conjunction with those 6-piston, and then we have a 2-piston caliper that is specifically for the handbrake, for, you know, drifting, initiating a slide, whatever the case may be. Continuing to talk about brakes, I've got the master cylinders mounted up here in the wiper cowl, so you can see we've got front brakes, rear brakes, and clutch, which all gravity feeds down to a floor-mounted OBP pedal box. This is a manual brake system, so you don't have to run a large vacuum booster on the firewall. Just not a fan of how they look, and I've always wanted to run a setup like this. Very, very complicated in this configuration. I always thought it was a lot simpler to mount a pedal assembly until I had to do it myself, and it's definitely not. It was a huge pain. I ended up going with soft lines, which will be covered by carpet in the end anyway, but they just a lot easier than running hardline. I had some issues flaring the stainless hardline, which most people would just tell me to man up and get it done, but given the tolerances or clearance I had down here, it was just too hard to be consistent, and the standards that I have for my own work are too high, and I just couldn't meet them. So I opted for a much more expensive but easier to route and to accomplish soft stainless braided line. Obviously the gas pedal here, brake and clutch. Gas pedal was trimmed down a little bit to clear the dash here. It's pretty tight in this setup. Clutch or brake pedal was also trimmed. You can see there's a small half moon clearance here, which doesn't affect braking, and honestly you can't really feel it. But when bleeding the brakes, you need that clearance because in the first few pedal throws, you actually will hit the steering shaft. Now that it's got pressure built up, it never travels that far, but if I have to bleed it again, I'll be able to. Lines come out of here. The front one goes up to a line lock that you probably can't see. You can see a small blue valve. That's a Wilwood drain back valve, and then it's a front line lock to lock the front brakes out for prepping the tires at the drag strip, heating them up, or just doing a big burnout or whatever it is you want to do. You have the option. And last but not least, we have the hydraulic handbrake. This is a chase-based setup. It's all black. It's pretty clean, exactly what I was looking for. It bolts to a plate that's welded to the trans tunnel here, and it has a Wilwood master that goes out to the 2-piston Brembo calipers that are on a specific and closed system for the handbrake. So if you ever were to lose your brakes here, you could pull this and still slow the vehicle down. It's not really why, it's just you don't want to have that that feeling. If you tap into your brake lines, which some of you guys may have done that, you can kind of feel like feedback when you push the brake or when you pull the handbrake. It will affect your pedal feel here. In this way, they're completely separate systems. There is no shared fluid or anything like that. And the reservoir for this master cylinder is conveniently mounted inside my Evo 8 center console with a nice little paper towel in the event that it leaks. And since I'm already in the interior, I might as well just move to this as the next topic. There are some things that may stand out right away to you as unfinished. The dash was wrapped in suede. I did it myself, and there are a few bubbles on this side that are kind of lifting up, I guess, from letting it sit in the sun. I used the wrong adhesive, I don't really know, so that's going to get redone. But then a much larger problem is the sagging that you're seeing here in the center. Now, this Evo 8 dash has been extremely popular amongst all Mighty Max guys that have seen it. I believe I'm the first to ever do it. And I'm stoked about that for sure. You know, like I said, this is not a popular vehicle, so that's partly why I'm able to say I'm the first. But I am really happy with it, and it fits perfect width-wise. Now, I don't have the plugs in the side panel here, but the width is almost exactly like the factory width that's necessary. And the top actually fit perfect before I put it in, but then once I tightened everything down and it sat in the sun and got hot last summer, it started to sag there in the center. Now, I do have working defrost. This dash had to be cut back significantly to fit in this truck, and then I had to recut it for the defrost vent, which was pretty hard, honestly, to get that right, and it had to be moved over because you have this contour here, and the vent obviously can't be on that bend as it needs to sit flat. So this will not sag when it's done, and the only reason it sags now is because I don't have anything supporting it right in that section. It drives me absolutely insane, and it will be fixed soon. Moving on to other things that aren't finished, I have an AEM CD7 dash in here. A company out of Australia called Mako Motorsports 3D prints these cluster surrounds, and they're really cool. It wasn't exactly perfect, but very, very close. And I just need to trim it out a little bit so I can drop this cluster down. And there's an entire surround that goes in here, which will hide this fabric, which shouldn't be there anyway, and will probably go away once I pay a professional to rewrap that. And it'll move the cluster down so that the line will be clean, so you won't see where it says AEM, but you will be able to see these shift lights across the top here. And then the center piece of the interior, which everyone notices instantly, is this Tesla style screen. This is an Android 9.8-inch head unit. It's a single DIN head unit behind it, meant to install into like a single DIN radio spot, and then I moved it back to flush mount it, and I built this panel, which is obviously not done. So this right here is a plastic welded piece that was filled, and I have a aftermarket hazard button that will go there, and then I've got OEM vents. This all came from a Lancer Virage out of the Taiwan market, and then I had to like modify it, build this whole trim, blah blah blah, spent a bunch of time, and I haven't finished it. Took this edge a little too far, so now I have to fill that back in. Same for the bottom. It needs to look perfect or I will not be happy with it. And then this whole thing is probably going to get carbon fiber skinned, or potentially just maybe I'll make a, I don't know, I might make a mold of it and then try to do it in carbon, but that's a whole nother learning curve for another decade maybe. I don't know, not super motivated to do that. But you can see everything works really well. Got the glove box in here. This is all Evo 8, Evo 9 stuff. And eventually it will be completely finished off, hopefully soon. Probably be one of the videos I put up after this one. Down here, this is not bolted in because I constantly have been removing it. But this is like a single DIN Evo 8 radio lower like relocation panel. And you can see it bolts up like stock. And then I've actually changed the plate out. Plastic welded a plate to the back side and then used a Dakota Digital vintage air control unit to control the AC and the heat. And then on either side here I have heated seat buttons. So yes, these Recaro SPG seats do have a heater assembly behind them. If I can show you, I will. That right there gets nice and warm when you turn it on, and it actually works surprisingly well without any fires, at least not yet. The rest of the Evo interior does fit in here too. I have a complete center console. I've got this relocated shifter rod that I had to build because I needed it to come out where the factory Evo console is, and it's definitely nicer. Before, you would essentially be like punching the dashboard. So again, everything here is really tight. It was tough to make all this fit, but in the end it actually fits really well. So I hope you guys look forward to seeing it complete. My wiring harness is not completely cleaned up. You can see there's a couple loose things going on back there, and that's because this is all, well, it's a chassis harness, but it's also part of the AEM. If you look underneath, you can see the ECU is chilling right there. Like I said before, it's an Infinity 506, and the engine harness comes through the firewall, plugs in, and then we have our chassis harness, which is also completely custom, that runs up through here, and then we have our wiring that goes off through like our dash area up here. We got an alarm system, we have the cluster, all that good stuff, and then this is like a phone charger. This is a, you know, the gauge cluster. Maybe you can like program the gauge cluster. I don't know what it's for. Sometimes you just forget that stuff. This is the bottom of the vintage air unit, and then yeah, a couple more wires hanging down, but like I said, it's not done, so those things will all go away. Moving to the sound system, or lack thereof, I'm pretty happy with it. The speakers in the doors are Phoenix Gold, and they're super old. I really just didn't want to drive it at all without speakers. Ideally, I'm going to build fiberglass door panels that use part of the Lancer upper panel and then bolt to these like aluminum block-offs, so it will kind of follow the curvature of the Lancer dash into the panel, much like the factory Evos do and Lancers. But for now, this was kind of just thrown together to have some music. There's two Phoenix Gold 6.5-inch component speakers in here. And then back here I've got a kicker shallow mount subwoofer that I built with a carpeted MDF enclosure that barely fits below the roll cage, but it does fit, and it actually sounds really well. It's just barely enough airspace for it to work, but I've been pretty happy. And then I have a 4-channel 2000 watt Sony amp pushing the speakers, and obviously I'm not using anywhere near the wattage that comes with that assembly. Steering wheel wise, we got a Momo leather wheel with some red stitching and some titanium mounting bolts that I don't really care for. We got a lot of clashing colors here, but probably get rid of that red horn. This is a remote control for the radio volume, which looks cheaper than it did on the internet, so that might end up going. And then we've got a black headliner, a Broadway mirror, and obviously the roll cage is completely welded in with removable door bars. It was fully TIG welded. It tucks up really high. You hardly notice it's even in here, especially when the door bars are taken out. And you can see the attachment points on both ends. Before moving outside the truck, the last thing I want to talk about is the transmission, the floor, and the trans tunnel. So this is an ASN AR5 out of a Chevy Colorado. It's a common question with the rear wheel drive 4G63 guys, or especially the Mighty Max swap guys, is what trans can I run and what's going to be strong enough. And most of you want to run a KM132, which is a factory Mighty Max transmission from like a 2-liter carbureted truck. I think 89 was the last year they were 2.0 liter. And that trans will work. It'll actually bolt up, assuming you have a narrow block version. Anyhow, those, they work and you can drive it, but it doesn't really hold any amount of power. And if you're making over like 300 foot-pounds, or you just clutch drop the truck once, there's a good chance it will explode. So rather than build this thing with that trans and have a drive shaft and a trans mount and an exhaust system that all work in conjunction with each other, I went with the AR5 to negate that problem just straight away. It did create a lot more work for me though, as it didn't fit under the factory floor, so I built an entire new floor. So despite the fact that this is completely covered with sound deadening and you can't see it, this is all 16 gauge sheet. I opted for 16 gauge because I did not want to buy a bead roller at the time, and it was very heavy, so I may regret that when I go to finally weigh this thing. But all 16 gauge sheet, wheel wells, firewall, and then a 16 gauge trans tunnel and drive shaft tunnel, all built by me. It took a very long time, mostly due to the learning curve. But yeah, it houses the AR5 trans, and then this AR5 uses a R154 to 4G63 bell housing adapter to bolt up to the block. And it was a straightaway bolt-on thing. You didn't have to really figure much out, except for the fact that the AR5 uses a hydraulic throwout bearing where the R154 does not. I opted to go that route, and I used a 01 Camaro T56 spec throwout bearing with some spacing to get it all sorted. And then I used a all-wheel drive Eclipse flywheel, and a front-wheel drive Eclipse clutch disc, I believe. I have that written down somewhere. It was challenging at the time to figure it all out, and I went through multiple times of buying the wrong parts. But that's the setup. It's got a South Bend 6-disc sprung clutch in it, good for, I think, 700 foot-pounds of torque, and we're not going to be anywhere near that even on ethanol, so we should be good to go for a while. And then to finish that off, I have a short throw shifter from, I cannot remember the company. It's the only place I've ever found that makes them for the AR5, and it's pretty short. So there's first, second, third, fourth. You get the idea. Very short throw, feels really nice. It's really tight, and it's obviously gotten better as I've kind of what seems like broken it in. And as far as handbrake movement, I do know it looks very close, but unless you are really trying, there is no way for those two to touch. Now, if you pull the handbrake in first gear, you do get close, but I'm not sure why you would really do that. So there's that. Moving outside, we have some APR carbon side mirrors. We have some forged carbon wrap on these little side pieces behind the doors. And then we have a blind spot monitoring camera, and those come on whenever you hit the turn signal, so you can see who's in that lane. I know it's overkill, but I was really stoked on those. And then we have, obviously, no fenders. They are coming along, and that'll be a video for sure on how to build those. They're just not done yet. And then we have the bed. So the bed is obviously going to be complete as well at some point. The battery will not be exposed, but this is what we're working with currently. So this is a custom rear frame, and if you look straight here, you can see there's like a plate welded right there. That is stock frame rail. This is new frame rail. And there's a company called Checkered Racing. You can call them, tell them what you have, tell them what you want, and they will send you a set of mandrel bent frame rails already welded together to a crossbar here, and you have to weld it in. So that was pretty tough. Had to cut the whole back of the truck off. I did it in a fixture. It took me some serious time, but it's super straight. It aligns perfectly, and it drives straight too. So I guess we're good in that respect. The drive shaft loop looks ridiculous. When I first made this drive shaft, I did not have the clearance to run the loop, and I went to set the truck down on the ground for the first time, and they were hitting. So a quick fix was to cut it out of my way, and I will extend it and weld it back on in the future, as I cannot stand getting asked questions as to why it's left. Moving on, the drive shaft is a 4-inch aluminum drive shaft. It's just the right length where it had to be like a 1/4 inch bigger per the recommendations of the drive shaft builder. So that's why I went with 4-inch. It is aluminum, so it's a little bit lighter, and it should be more than strong enough for this this setup. The rear end is a Ford 8.8 with a 373 gear and a factory LSD. It's got some 7590 Mobil 1 in it, and it's mostly stock. It's got a B&M diff cover, and then I actually widened it on both sides. You can see the welds right there on the axle tube. Both sides have been set up to use the longer axles. The Ford Explorer that it came out of has a offset differential, so it would sit to one side, but leave the passenger side is shorter. This actually has 2 driver side axles, so it's like a poor man's way of having a wide rear end. And the only reason for doing that was to try to combat the ridiculous width of the front end with the 240SX steering angle kit from Wisefab. It actually pushes the front end out like 2 inches over stock on each corner, which ends up pushing this to 5 inches wider than factory on both sides. Therefore, I need a really wide fender. I wanted to make the back match so that I don't have to run a huge wheel spacer, but eventually I will just run a wider wheel in the back to make up for what you're seeing right now, which is a 2 1/4 inch difference from the front to the rear, both using a 9.5 inch wide plus 22 offset wheel. Suspension wise, we have QA1 rear drag spec coilovers. These were ordered with generic spring rates, and they will have to be changed out or at least modified with different springs to account for the actual final weight of the truck. The bed needs to be finished first. It's going to probably add 150 pounds, maybe not quite that much, but I do want to build a functional bed, so I don't want to assume the weight on that just yet. Once that's done, I can order the right springs and maybe call it a day. These shock mounts may end up getting changed. I built these probably like 4 years ago, and I built them with an angle grinder. I didn't have access to plasma cutters or laser cutters at the time. And although they look, you know, they look like they were cut by hand, I kind of like them. It's kind of like nostalgic for me, but it also looks shitty to anyone who just walks up and checks it out. So they might end up going, I might leave them, haven't really decided yet. And of course, the full reason for running this rear end was to run the parallel 4-link bars that you see here. Again, Checkered Racing sends you this setup already done. Unfortunately, there were a few changes that had to be made due to some measurements being overlooked. Initially, the 4-link mounts were on the inside of the frame rail. They were moved out, and then they were welded on the axle accordingly. So Got a pan hard bar there in the middle that just keeps the axle from moving left and right or shifting really hard. And this one is arguably too short, but it was the best option given the space that I have. I haven't noticed any real problems with it. If I end up noticing issues, I will do a Watts link most likely. And I think there's enough room to figure something out on the back of the pumpkin or differential there. You can see I got soft lines throughout the truck. As I said, I hate doing the hard lines. So that came out okay. And then I've got, separate systems. So one's for the handbrake and one is for the regular brakes. The exhaust, you can see, snakes over the frame here, comes over here and out the side, and it used to look really, really cool until I had to cut this section out when I removed the wheel well for the wide body. So someday soon this will all get closed up, cleaned up, primed, possibly painted, and then the over fender will go on top, and you won't see any of that. So one video we are going to do is the exhaust going up over the axle, down and out the rear of the truck. And while I'm pointing at the rear, you can see there's a small cartridge there. That's actually the AC condenser. It's got a dryer built into it, and it's got 2 fans on the bottom side, which is kind of tough to see. And that allows for the radiant heat of the radiator and intercooler to completely stay away from the condenser, and vice versa. So any of the heat being extracted from the condenser due to the AC system running will not superheat the radiator and basically make it harder for everything to stay cool. So this setup, I'm excited about it. I wanted to do it for a really long time, and I haven't charged it yet, like I said, but I know it's going to work. It's not exactly something new. Moving to the fuel cell, this is an Aeromotive illuminator cell, so the pump sits in the tank. It is a super high volume. I think it flows enough to do like 1300 on 93 octane, and 30% of that on ethanol, so 790 or something, and somewhere in there, more than I'm gonna make. Should be fine. It's got a single pump, and you just pop this up and everything sits in there. It's all baffled and stuff as well, so you don't need a swirl pot or a surge tank or any of that. And that was a big concern of mine because the stock tank used to sit up there with the fuel pump mounted all the way up in the front. So under hard acceleration, all the fuel would slosh back, and it makes it difficult if you ever want to get on the throttle under a half or a quarter tank of fuel, which you don't plan to do, but I mean, it's a ridiculous limitation in my opinion. Lastly, back here we have what's supposed to be a remote filler neck. I had my friend weld this inlet here with this hose, and then I wanted to do basically like a tucked fuel filler behind the taillight, and then I kind of lost interest, and then I got it running, and I was filling it from here. But when you have a full bed floor in here, that's obviously not going to be an option. So I have to have something else I can do to fill it up, and I also don't want to either remove what's in the bed or have to figure out a way to lock this, because right now, obviously you could tamper with it pretty easily. So what happened is this thing started leaking, and it's got a big bead welded all the way around on it, but for some reason the hose still leaks. This hose is like really overpriced. I think it was $50 for this short length I've got here. It is fuel safe hose, but it doesn't matter if it leaks here. So I need to figure that out. And while I was not figuring it out, it leaked all over the frame, took off all the paint that I had back here, and dripped all over the street while I was driving. So lost a lot of motivation to finish that because of that, and I've just been filling it up to a lower level. Again, I don't drive it very much. It's obviously not done, but that's something that needs to be handled pretty soon as well. As far as other miscellaneous things like the battery, that will eventually be in a flush mounted toolbox where you won't be able to see it from the side profile, and it will only open in the center because of the restriction of the roll cage bars. But it'll just give me a place to put like a jack, a small like road trip package basically. The battery will live in there as well, and it'll have external terminals so that I can jump it or charge it if need be, and it will be out of the elements. That is a bike rack over there. It's a Yakima rack with 1 5/8" like LED light bar mounts used to mount it to the cage. I have one on this side too, and unfortunately I chipped the paint here. So I gotta wet sand this anyway. I'll touch that up, and then hopefully I can use them both. But right now I'm just worried about the bike falling around like a hard turn or something, and because I don't have a bed floor, if it was to somehow get caught in the drive shaft, it would cause a pretty big problem. So eventually that will get used when I have a complete bed floor. I've already talked about that, so you get the idea. Back window is Lexan. It's really dirty. I've been neglecting cleaning it just because it's so hard to clean it without scratching it. It will eventually get some 3D printed plugs that go right here to keep that completely sealed. Probably window weld them in, or some other sort of silicone that's safe for this application where it won't like crack or leak or whatever. And it's cool because I was able to use 1/4" Lexan, which allowed me to run the factory window seal all the way around. I did have to cut it in the center there for the roll cage, since I couldn't get it around given that I built these before I had that seal. But it works pretty well, and I don't have to run like the 1/8 inch bracing or like small framing that people use to hold Lexan and keep it from vibrating. Because I use 1/4 inch, it's so thick, I don't have that problem regardless. So all in all, I'm pretty stoked about that, and that explains most of the maybe questions you have when you look at the bed. To kind of close things out, the reason for this truck or why I built it is mostly just to be different. You know, everyone builds 240s or Evos or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a big fan of all those cars, but I had this thing sitting here one day. It was sitting next to my Evo, and I was like, that'd be kind of cool to do like a similar drivetrain, but make it rear wheel drive and whatever. And you know, that's fairly common. There are a lot of 4G swap Mighty Maxes, so there's some information out there, not as much as I would have hoped, but I eventually figured it all out and got it all together. And you know, it's still got heat, it's still got AC. It's something that I'd like to be able to drive, maybe not every day, but be able to if necessary. If you haven't noticed, I don't have wipers on it right now. Eventually I will figure out a hidden wiper motor situation. But you know, I want it to be usable. I have a hard time putting this much time and money into anything and not be able to enjoy it whenever I want. So that's the main purpose. You know, it's got the angle kit. I can drift it if I want. It's not really necessary for drifting, but I don't know, just something different. So if I wanted to slide it around, I can. If I want to drag race it, I could raise it, put some tires on it, maybe drag race it and get a decent pass out of it. It's kind of just set up to be well-rounded, and I hope that it does that. On the 16 pounds that it's on right now, 93 octane, it's maybe making 400, you know, 350-ish. There's a lot of guys with whole sets that are making somewhere in that power range. The ultimate goal is to get it on E85, keep this turbo set up, don't change any of it, there's no real need, and hopefully crack 580, maybe 600, depending on the dyno. Whatever it'll do before it starts blowing hot air, so 40 pounds-ish, maybe 35. It's a ceramic wheel or whatever, it's not the billet wheel, so I may need to switch that out if I want to be efficient at that boost level. But yeah, that's the end goal. And last but not least, the paint. So obviously it's got to be all red, and it drives me nuts that it's not. But until I have the time to finish the fiberglass fenders all the way around, I'm not going to paint just the small components like the hood and the fenders. The front bumper and the lower valance are both completed. I do need to figure out like a front lip of some sort, maybe a splitter. And I want it to actually be functional, so it will take a bit more time than if I just did it for aesthetics. Something you can stand on, you know, is ideal. Obviously, why have it if you can't use it? And then get their over fenders done, spray everything red, potentially do an air cup system on it so it's easier to drive. It is super low. It's got a lot of clearance, but it's definitely low at this ride height. So maybe figure out some coilovers that are better up front quality wise and run some air cups at the same time. Make it a little more usable if I want to haul my pit bike or something. Yeah, that's pretty much everything. So I hope you guys like this video, and please look forward to more videos about this truck. I'm going to do the exhaust soon. I'm going to do the inner bed very soon, and then the fenders will probably come last, and I'll wrap it all up with paint. But of course, there might be some changes along the way, like drive-by-wire throttles, seats, carpet, stuff like that. So I hope you guys like this video. Thanks for watching. Peace out.